Just flew in from China, and boy, are his arms tired. Please welcome to the stage Simon Henry of Juwai.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's fantastic to be here. I live in Shanghai, in China. For those people who haven't been there recently, I strongly, strongly recommend it. It's a city which 10 years ago they didn't have a subway. Now they've got 465 miles of one of the world's most sophisticated subway systems in the world. To work with Chinese buyers, you should really go and see Chinese in China. Today I'm going to walk you through some insights which have never been seen before. This market is a big market. It's a multi-billion-dollar market right now, and it's looking to increase fourfold over the next 4 years. When we first started tracking in Chinese investment in international property, it was about $5 billion a year back in 2010. Last year it was $52 billion. And CBRE estimates it's going to grow to $220 billion by the year 2020. The growth in Chinese investment in international property actually started around 30 years ago, when the government put in place policies which have allowed the growth of wealth in the market today. And today you see wealth being generated from technology, mining, manufacturing, infrastructure, and services. Over the last 6 months, Juwai conducted a little over 46,000 interviews with Chinese property buyers. We've heard a lot of press about this market, but mostly it's been from the seller side. This is the first time we actually see from the buyer side what their motivations are, what their drivers are, and how they're based. Really big one here. Number one reason why Chinese invest in international property is investment. Number one. They are already property rich in China. They already own multiple houses, multiple residences, multiple businesses. They're looking to diversify their risk in their portfolio by investing in property internationally. Number two is immigration. Number three is education. When Chinese send their kids overseas to study, they typically will buy a property for their children to live in while they study overseas. I was talking to a broker in New York in January, and there was a property on the market in New York for $5.2 million. And the property buyer said, I'm not paying a cent more than $5 million US. And the agent said, it's worth 5.2. Why can't you go above 5? He says, for my daughter to live in while she's studying, and I don't want to spoil her. The third motivation is lifestyle. Luxury properties, holiday homes, places of residence overseas. The really interesting thing here is the age bracket. It's across the board. From under 34 to 45, and above 45. The average age of an EB5 investor from China is 24 years of age. So parents are funding their children to get an EB5 visa, not only here, but in Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Australia. The super interesting thing here is the readiness and the timeliness to buy. On average, a Chinese international buyer, the time they're ready to buy is around 6 months. And that puts a real challenge for markets where property is turning over very, very quickly. So if you get a lead from a Chinese buyer today, and you're in a market where properties are on market for 20 days, 30 days, or 40 days, you're really cultivating a lead now, not for the properties you have in your stock right now, but the properties which you're looking to acquire in 6 months' time. So it's a long, nurturing process. It's like the mixed martial arts of real estate, I think, working with international buyers. You need to have different skill sets, you need to have patience, you need to continue to communicate and work with Chinese buyers over their life cycle. The average budget of a Chinese buyer is about $2.6 million US, and the average first purchase price, $933,000 US. And what that immediately says is these are multiple property buyers. They don't just buy one, they buy one a year, 2 a year, 3 a year. We had one buyer who came to us and she said, I've got $5 million US to spend every year for the next 5 years. Which country do I start with first? They are seasoned investors. But when working with a Chinese buyer, particularly if it's their first purchase offshore, they act like a first home buyer. We had another buyer who bought a property in Carolina for $100,000 US. That was the amount of money she was willing to lose to educate herself about how to buy property in the United States. She came back and bought a $10 million property 4 months later. China is a big place. 242 spoken living dialects in China today. If you look at the eastern seaboard, that's where most of the current wealth in China resides. But you're starting to see the wealth being generated in the middle territories and middle provinces of China. 34 provinces, 23 provinces, 4 provincial level governments, and then you've got Macau also and Hong Kong, which are administrative regions. So when you're talking about Chinese, you're not also just talking about mainland China, you're talking about Chinese globally. 30% of our inquiry and leads come from Chinese who live outside of China. This is a map just of the last 30 days. So a little over $10 billion worth of property searches in the last 30 days. The top map is where they're searching from. The bottom map is where they're searching to. So right in the center of the map on the top, that's mainland China. But if you look also at the communities in Europe, United States, Australia, New Zealand, they are very large ethnic Chinese populations right across the world. And you see where they're looking below. Number one market, and this is where the United States has the biggest advantage. 30% of all inquiry for Chinese buying property internationally comes to the United States. Next biggest market is Australia, the third is Canada, fourth is UK, and fifth is Singapore. When I said before that 70% of our consumers come from mainland China and 30% come from offshore, here's just an example of some of the cities around the world. And you can actually see a breakdown of the percentage of people who come from China versus other areas. So just looking at the US ones, Los Angeles. So 60% of the inquiry for Los Angeles comes from mainland China. The next biggest one is directly here from within the United States. The United States has 50 cities with more than 100,000 ethnic Chinese population. The domestic Chinese audience is a big audience. Then Australia, United Kingdom, France, and other countries. For San Francisco, China number 1, again, USA number 2. Australia, United Kingdom, and then Hong Kong. In New York, United States, Australia, then France. When people talk China, they talk big numbers. 30 million visitors to our site each month, 150 million visitors to our site each month. The numbers are huge because the domestic population is very, very big. But in reality, there is a very small subset of people who have the means, the ability, and the motivation to invest in international property. There's 242 billionaires in China, second only to the United States, with a new billionaire being minted every 2 weeks. 1.5 million millionaires. And millionaires is defined as having net worth of $1.5 million, excluding their primary residence. The real market, and the market which is going to hit us in the next 12 to 18 months, are the 60 million people who are entering the middle class. That's the market which are motivated, they're sending their kids overseas to study, and they're looking to emigrate. The motivations are fourfold. There's a catch-all. Last year, 114 million Chinese nationals from mainland China traveled internationally. We've all done it. We've gone for a holiday to France or popped into Venice or gone to a location where we go, this would be great, I'd love to own a home here. Travel is the number one reason why people are becoming interested in international real estate. Number 2, investment. They're looking to diversify their risk. Emigration. The big difference between the Chinese now and the Japanese of the 80s is the Chinese are generational buyers. They may actually buy a property now for their children to live in 18 years' time when they're studying, and which the child will then get a visa to live in a country after that. They're not short-term speculators. They are long-term investors. Education's a huge one. Up until the year 2000, a total of 500,000 Chinese students had studied overseas in the history of China. Up to the year 2000, a total of 500,000 students had studied internationally in the history of China. Last year, it was 565,000 in a single year. USA is the biggest beneficiary of outbound education. The other thing which you really got to consider quite carefully too is the way which a Chinese buyer makes contact is very different from a domestic buyer. Chinese do not email. They first and foremost will pick up a telephone and call you direct or call a call center. That's the way things happen in China. If you buy anything on any of the e-commerce sites, within 3 seconds of you hitting the order button, you've received a phone call saying, just checking your order, is there anything you'd like to add to it? How can I help you further? When they buy international property, they do the same thing. So roughly 37% of Chinese will make contact while they're still in mainland China. 31% will make contact through family and friends. We had one property buyer in Sydney, Australia. He walked into an office, a CBRE office, paid $20 million for a commercial property, and the franchise owner said, how'd you hear about us? He said, well, my father found it online, he lives in China, he wired me the money, wired me the link, and said, go buy this property. If the franchise owner hadn't asked, he would never have known where that buyer had come from. Most Chinese do what we call fly and buy. They do all their research online, and then they make a visit to see a broker or an agent once they travel to that country. So it's all about making sure you are seen, people know your region, people know your area, and people know how to find you when they do travel overseas. When working with a Chinese buyer, the biggest piece of advice I can actually give you is if a Chinese person walked into your office tomorrow and spoke no English, how ready are you to receive that buyer? How ready are you to receive somebody who has got absolutely no language skills but has a pocket full of cash ready to buy something from you? Best thing you can do is get some information about your local market, team up with your local Chinese association or chamber of commerce, get to know Chinese agents or brokers in your area, engage with your local Chinese community, because at the end of the day, international really does start at home. They want to see who you are. They want to see what capabilities you've got. When you also market property to Chinese, you have to think macro, think big. Generally, real estate is a local exercise. You talk about things like what's down the road, what local shops, what local schools. When working with Chinese, you need to go macro. How do I get there? What airports are local? What's the benefit of this school district over another school district? What we're seeing now is quite a big trend of mothers coming over to the United States and living in the houses while their children go to school. There was a case in a New York Times not too long ago of a Chinese buyer on Long Island, paid $15 million for a property, handed the keys to the broker and said, I'll see you in 2 years' time. The broker said, but who's going to look after the house? And she said, look, just concrete over the grass. I don't really need to look after this. And it was a great opportunity then for the broker to say, no, let's look at property management. Let's get this underway and say we actually manage this property for you and your future investment. So working with Chinese buyers is not as straightforward as listing something on a Zillow or Trulia. It's most likely going to happen where people walk into your office. They're going to come and say hello to you. They're going to be using something called WeChat. Who here has not heard of WeChat? Everyone, pretty much. Used by a little over 800 million people in mainland China, and it's great built-in auto-translate feature of chat. So you can have a direct communication with Chinese consumers using WeChat. Everyone in China uses it. So you can actually be sitting in your office, they can be chatting to you on WeChat, you can be pushing translate and have a conversation with them face to face. So that's how you get ready with a Chinese buyer straight away. It's an incredibly big market, but still international buyers generally account for around 10% of any total property market. So it is niche, it is specialized, it does require patience, it does require long lead times, and it does require getting used to the fact that they may come hot today and then cold tomorrow. Because when Chinese buy property offshore, it's not just about the property. They typically need to get advice on tax, legal, finance, immigration, and these things do take time. So my recommendation to you is enjoy the experience. It's a great market. It's a big market. Their ticket price is 4 or 5 times that of a domestic buyer, but they do take time. So thank you very much for your time today.